Hello, everyone, and welcome to the live kickoff of Conference to Restore Humanity 2024. And as you can see, vision into reality. My name is Nick Covington. I'm the creative director here at Human Restoration Project, which is also represented this week by a number of wonderful people that we've been able to add to the HRP team this year and to our awesome board of directors, past and present. So HRP full-time staff here, myself, Chris, and Cassie. If you can give little waves or little things in the video there, and then of course to our team and to again our board members, our new ones, the ones who have rotated out because we've been around long enough now to have to do that. So if this was in person, this is where I'd have everybody stand up and give a little wave. So again, feel free to do that. So while people are doing that, if you haven't had a chance to, just go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat. Quick shout out as well to Farima, who's our staff artist now, whose artwork has kind of become the public face of HRP. Yeah, it's so great. You'll see her work all over. She obviously designed the conference logo and all the little stuff that we use here. And also to Mal, who is in the room with us here, who's our community manager and whose avatar of Hootie the Owl from Owl House, you'll find as the face of the Discord server too. So feel free to reach out to Mal if you need help navigating that. I'll be emceeing the live events this week, and I promise that today is going to be the most that you're going to hear from me as I kind of have the pleasure to both kick us off and facilitate the first live Q&A with Dr. Helen Immordino-Yang here in a little bit, and whose recorded keynote you've hopefully been able to thoughtfully consider. The last comment I was able to read on the Discord said they felt like they were back in college having to take all those notes, and I echo that totally. I had to watch through it twice to make sure that I got everything. So yeah, if you can just be prepared with your questions for Mary Helen here in a little bit. We'll be able to ask those both in the chat. You can unmute, we can talk. Hopefully this is a little bit of a different type of webinar for a different type of conference. And as a quick reminder for our schedule today, I've got it up on my screen here. After the Q&A this morning, you'll have a break before you can join your learning track for their live session from 1 to 2:30 Eastern. And then this afternoon, you'll be hearing again from myself and the HRP team. We'll talk about partnering to change schools for a thriving world. Then we'll take a tour of the awe-inspiring, frankly, community lab school. And then we'll play a game of Analogia with the creator, with the designer, the later on this evening that you're not going to want to miss. And hopefully then, also this afternoon, we'll just release Dr. Sausan Jaber's keynote for you to consider before her own live Q&A tomorrow. So you'll have that to digest as well. Real quick, if you haven't yet, if you're joining from an email link or from another way of joining Zoom that's not on Discord, this would be the perfect time to join that. If you're new to the platform, it might look a lot at first, but there's only a couple of places that you really need to be to participate. Just be sure to verify your ticket in the Join Conference channel. That'll let you select your track. That'll get you access to the learning track resources and channels there, and then you can begin to contribute your thoughts to that as well. And of course, feel free to reach out to the help desk channel if you have any questions, or reach out to anybody tagged HRP or anyone associated with the conference as well. And of course, I'd like to just thank you all for joining us this week to include HRP and this community of learners in your summer plans in the middle of July, and give a special shout out to our donors and our supporters who have helped us get where we are today. We quite literally could not do this without you, and the list just grows and grows and grows. Every year we have to add a slide with those folks. I'd like to additionally thank this year's sponsors, our transcription partner, Cortico, who in the recent past has become a lot more than that, and we're excited to work more with them in the future. But Cortico's Fora app brings people together in recorded small group conversations around their lived experiences, and it's the engine that powers HRP's professional development work with schools. Through a powerful combination of AI and human listening, Fora enables organizations to make sense of conversations they collect, surfacing community voices into public dialogue and decision-making with authenticity, nuance, and transparency that typical surveys and focus groups can't match. Next up is the Minor Collective. The Minor Collective is a community-based movement to reimagine school, and Thought Sanctuary is a gathering space curated by the Minor Collective for educators to meet joyfully, safely, and powerfully, generating ideas that are dream-based yet reality-laden. Characterized by this thoughtful approach, participants in Thought Sanctuary can look forward to making connections with other conference attendees, sharing abundant ideas, staying curious, and having some fun. So here, everyone will work together to help all the powerful learning from keynotes, conversations, and workshops land, touching on the realities of everyday classroom life. And you can join the Thought Sanctuary on Discord Wednesday and Thursday from 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern. I'm definitely looking forward to that. And finally, in addition to being among HRP's closest friends and collaborators, the STEMpunks Foundation is dedicated to creating a more inclusive and equitable world for neurodivergent and disabled individuals. By challenging traditional systems and advocating for accessibility, STEMpunks promotes a supportive community that celebrates diversity and empowers people to thrive in their unique ways. Their innovative approach combines direct support with advocacy and education, driving change in both public perception and policy. And I know Ryan of the STEMpunks will be heavily active in the Discord this week as well. So feel free to reach out to Ryan if you want to learn more about that. So with that said, I wanted to kick off things this week by referencing the past, present, and future through the lens of our conference theme, Vision into Reality. And longtime HRP followers know we lean heavily into that science fiction aesthetic, and we've always drawn from Octavia Butler's Afrofuturism. And it may not have escaped a lot of people. There were a lot of blog posts over the weekend and everything else, but readers of her work, Parable of the Sower, may recognize this week as the first entry in the main character, Lauren Olamina's journal. So back in 1993, Octavia Butler imagined what America would be like in 2024 as a country descended into chaos, facing massive damage from social inequality, climate change, the collapse of democracy. The book and its second entry are part warning and part hopeful journey. It tasks readers to understand that it's possible to maintain our humanity and build a better world, even in times of extreme turmoil. And the main character, Lauren Olamina, despite facing the worst tragedies that one can face, acts to lead others towards her reimagined future. She works to channel and embrace change as a force to do something meaningful and different. And the first passage of what becomes the foundation of Lauren Olamina's philosophy, Earthseed, is from Sunday, July 21st, 2024. We missed it by one day. And it reads, "All that you touch, you change. All that you change changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change." Now, the book is silent about what happens for the 4 days of July 22nd through the 25th. So I guess we'll have to write those chapters this week here together. And to help situate our hearts and minds living and shaping the future Octavia Butler herself imagined, but unfortunately did not live to see, as we come together this week to turn vision into reality. And so Adrienne Marie Brown, you might be familiar with her work in immersion strategy, is another author and organizer who's influenced by Octavia Butler's work and whose work in immersion strategy obviously influences our own as well. Now, these are her principles of immersion strategy that we've used to help center our work with educators. And as we start here today, I'd like for you just to take a couple of minutes to scan these, read through them real quick, focus on one or two of those ideas, and in the chat, if you could, share which one perhaps connects with you and why this morning, or one that you'd like to focus on, even one that might be a challenge. Like, I want to make sure that this really echoes with me this week, so I'm going to pay a lot of attention to that. Now, as you do that, I'll just quickly point out how thrilled I was to hear the word emergence in Mary Helen's keynote, and maybe you picked up on that as well. There's kind of an interesting syncretism happening with those. So what do we got? Cool. Susan says about the conversation being one that can only happen here now. Yeah, there's a conversation in the room that only these people in this moment can have. Let's find that, right? Not just in this a live space that we're sharing synchronously, but also taking that back to those asynchronous spaces. There may be a conversation that only we can have in this space this week in those Discord channels. Let's find that too. Nice. Natasha says there's always enough time for the right work. Awesome. Cool. What's resonating with Catherine? What you pay attention to grows. And perhaps that is like a lesson here as well, like where we put our hearts, our minds is going to be the thing that perpetuates into the future. So let's focus on building that future. Awesome. Keith says, small is good, small is all. That's a good reminder, especially perhaps for us in this room today, right? Like we're not 1,000 people right now. We're not 2,000 people, but as we'll kind of go through this, we can see, hey, one of us can spark a change in somebody else that will allow those things to flourish. I'll add to Keith's and say like that really resonated with me. Just because that's sort of the model that we want to see. The small is a model of what we want to see in the large. And Adrienne Marie Brown in Emergent Strategy writes that science fiction is where I go when I need the medicine of possibility applied to the trauma of human behavior. And when I reread that quote from her, I was certain that that medicine of possibility was something that we could all use a little bit of right now. So, all right. Shifting gears here, feel free to reflect, to add in the chat. Keep the chat going as a back channel the whole time if you want, right? Like this is a space for us and for you all to connect. But I'm going to move us into a little bit of a different space. So let's see if you can set this scene in your mind's eye, right? In the middle of the cool pine forest. Feel the cool dampness of the forest shade, the smell of the sap and of the forest flora and fauna. Perhaps the crunch and crackle of the pine needles underfoot, the rush of a stream in the distance, the ambiance of animal life. And I'd like to take us briefly into this forest on the trail of the pungent matsutake mushroom, which is of great cultural importance in Japan and of economic importance for foraging communities in the American Pacific Northwest, as is vividly documented by sociologist Anna Lowenhapt Singh in her book, The Mushroom at the End of the World. Now, it's necessary to talk of matsutake foraging as opposed to cultivation because, unlike its portabella brethren, it's a spore that refuses agricultural cultivation and mass production, even as its own emergence depends on the delicate interaction between human and arboreal ecosystems. So, matsutake can only emerge in pine forests disturbed by human contact, an accidental interspecies collaboration that's necessary for the life of the matsutake and for the cultural and economic life of the humans who pursue it. We're both changed by this accident of emergence, the forest floor contaminated with matsutake spores, and human society contaminated by our interaction with matsutake as those foraging communities and commerce emerge in pursuit of it. So, echoing Butler's notion of God as change, Singh writes, we change through our collaborations both within and across species. The important stuff for life on Earth happens in those transformations. And it is within change that she causes us to rethink contamination as collaboration, writing, rather than seeing only the expansion and conquest strategies of relentless individuals, we must look for histories that develop through contamination. We are polluted by histories of encounter. We are mixed up with others before we even begin any new collaboration. Worse yet, she says, we're mixed up in the projects that do us the most harm. The diversity that allows us to enter collaborations emerges from histories of extermination, imperialism, and all the rest. She continues, we're contaminated by our encounters. They change who we are as we make way for others. As contamination changes world-making projects, mutual worlds and new directions may emerge. Everyone carries a history of contamination. Purity is not an option. Staying alive for every species requires livable collaborations. Collaboration means working across difference, which leads to contamination. And without collaborations, we all die. It's kind of a downer note, but I promise there's more to come from this. And in that ecological metaphor, I hear again the echoes of Butler's Earthseed. All that you touch, you change. All that you change changes you. The only lasting truth is change. And I'd like for us to consider these concepts: change, emergence, the small is all, contamination, collaboration, as we proceed through a week of learning together where you will undoubtedly, hopefully, be affirmed, supported, and challenged. So let us embrace meaningful collaboration and the contamination that is required for it, and carry those spores of the encounters back with us into the world so that some new way of living, learning, and being might emerge. And finally, as we move from the forest floor to our first keynote addressed in the Q&A of this conference, that's focused on still another kind of change. So in December 2023, Dr. Mary Helen Immordino-Yang and her team at USC's Candle Lab released an article titled "Weaving a Colorful Cloth: Centering Education on Humans' Emergent Developmental Potentials." And we'll definitely post the link to the article in the Discord at some point. So in it, she argues we're on the verge of a fundamental shift in our understanding of human learning in relation to our models of education, one that she likens to the Copernican revolution. So, as Europeans began to unsettle the Earth-centered geocentric model and its supporting institutions and ideologies in the 16th century, so too must we reevaluate the fundamental assumptions of our model of education in light of new evidence, context, and values. The result is an overwhelming period of what appears to be unsurmountable complexity and turmoil, social and political polarization, inequity, and calls for justice, Immordino-Yang writes. And from this daunting and turbulent confluence, however, also emerges an appetite for fundamental conceptual change. Meanwhile, the pandemic age of the 21st century continues to careen from one crisis to the next, taking education systems with it. Educators are directed to control student bodies to mitigate a behavioral crisis, offered piecemeal SEL add-ons to meet a mental health crisis, and sold one-size-fits-all curriculum packages to resolve an academic one. Immordino-Yang argues that simply changing what we do or what we measure is important, but not sufficient until we understand and see from a new perspective. Fixes will be temporary, complicated, and awkward, just like Western pre-Copernican descriptions of the movements of heavenly bodies. Temporary, complicated, and awkward, just like Johann Kepler's 16th century model of a solar system in transition. And here we can imagine the cosmos understood by smart people who did not yet grasp that fundamental force, gravity, as the same one that pulled apples from the tree and kept Earth in orbit as a planet around our common star. There comes a point, she writes, when some of the field's most basic models of learning no longer serve society well, and we have reached that point. The need for a paradigm shift akin to a Copernican revolution in our understanding of human learning has never been more important than in the pandemic age, where crises abound and traditional education models falter and dogs bark. I don't know if you can hear my dogs barking in the background. However, innovative, conscientious, and responsive models of education like those put into action by our conference leaders this week realize a vision of education that is not merely a means of imparting knowledge, but a catalyst for transformation and global justice. As Mary Helen urges, the mission of reshaping education systems, of turning vision into reality, is not just necessary, but imperative for a sustainable and just future. To move toward a more sustainable and just future for society and the planet, the policies that guide and structure our work in systems of education must also be aligned with these insights, she writes. The implication for how we redesign education systems and for how we rethink classrooms and the profession of teaching are equal parts exciting and daunting. The task ahead is undoubtedly one of the most critical of our time. How are you doing this morning?
I'm just fine this morning. Thanks for
Okay.
asking. How are you all?
We're doing great.
Good.
Um, let's see here. Yeah. Um, let's see. Should we go ahead? Chris, do you see anybody who has their hand up right now? I'm trying to look at the I don't see any hands. But perhaps I could go ahead. Hopefully, I can get my Discord up on here. There we go. Um, I'll just reserve my own privilege as sort of the MC host of the Q&A here, just to ask my first question here. It's the kind of thing that was going through the back of my mind as I was going through this, but um, I think perhaps progressive education has a narrative problem in the sense that it's a bit of a squishy liability in the horror world of evidence-based practice. And I see your work and others in affective neuroscience as sort of the antidote to that squishiness. And I think, but at the same time, I think it's also obvious to most classroom teachers that the system's not particularly responsive to that body of evidence. So I wonder two things. Maybe why is that? Like, why aren't classrooms being and systems being more responsive to the work you're doing and what we saw in your keynote? And um, how can we, those of us who want a more experiential, holistic, responsive approach, what can we do better to make that neurobiological case for progressive education?
Yeah. Wow. Thanks for starting off gently there, Nick. I
Yeah.
appreciate that, you know.
Hey, nobody else raised their hand, so that's kind of on you all, honestly.
Yeah, no. I mean, I see what you're saying. I think there are several questions actually hidden in the one, right? The first one is wait, I just got a pop-up here that says confirm you're speaking Portuguese. No, does that matter? Somebody else? I don't know. I'm just gonna cancel that. All right, great. Sorry, that's okay. I'm
All
not
good.
speaking Portuguese. Yeah, definitely not. Although it might sound like Portuguese to you, in which case, please raise your hand and ask me to clarify. That's fine too. Yeah, so there are a couple questions kind of layered in. The first one is, what does it mean to be evidence-based? The second one is, what's the goal of education, right? And evidence needs to be toward a goal. Evidence is not neutral. Evidence on what? What do we want evidence about, right? And then the third one is, what do you do about the evidence, right? So we'll just take those in order. So the first one is, what does it mean to be evidence-based? I think we have a case in education right now where the things that are easy to measure are the things that we're teaching to, because they're easy to measure, and then that becomes evidence-based, right? Which it's true, it is evidence-based, but, and that leads into the second question, what if the evidence base isn't actually pertaining to the things that matter most in an educational setting? What if the evidence on quote unquote learning is actually only specific to very particular aspects of learning that are maybe important, but maybe not central and not the whole picture by any means, right? And I think that's the situation we're in. And then that leads to the third thing, which is, what is the goal of education, right? Because you can't use evidence in a kind of neutral way. You select evidence, and scientists also frame evidence. We frame our studies around what we think is important to learn about, right? You don't study everything with equal amount of effort. There are some things that you start to study because you think they're important or interesting. And we need to shift that conversations, because the goal of education, right, really isn't, and I've been writing about this more now, and like, just hold for the whole sentence before you look shocked and horrified. The goal of education is not learning, right? The goal of education is human development. How do we position people to be experienced, whole humans who can actually engage in building the kind of world we need to have, not just managing themselves in the world we do have, but inventing the world we need, which has all kinds of layers of technological savvy and expertise, environmental and ecological savvy and expertise, democratic and societal and interpersonal expertise, civic expertise. And so when you backstep from that, learning is not the goal. Learning is the means. We learn things in order to develop into certain kinds of humans who are positioned to be able to do certain kinds of things, who bring certain skill sets, certain dispositions, certain capacities to the world. And the learning sciences, I would argue, have stopped at what have you learned, right? Because that's straightforward to measure. But the problem is that isn't actually what the aim is. We need to get all the way to, and what does it do for you as a person to have learned this? And that's where we're inventing new kinds of evidence and new ways of understanding that are more dynamic, more emergent, and better reflect, I think, what we're starting to really understand about the nature of being a human.
Oh my goodness. So a small answer to a small question.
You
So
asked, man.
this this gets to something that was we were talking about in the Discord chat about the keynote, and the last 10 minutes of your keynote video really compares, contrasts those two classroom settings, and really I think brings those things home. And Beth kind of reiterates it on over here too in the chat, which is, what should we look for or listen for? What are some of those things that you as a researcher were finding as you compared those two case studies, or even more, because you said it was
Yeah,
also
those are examples of
yeah.
40, right, that we pulled together, 40 teachers, and now we have more, but the study that those are from is 40 teachers. So there's a whole range, right? There's a whole range of, we picked things from the extremes because that's kind of more obvious for you to see. But what we're finding is that those narratives that teachers, you can imagine that those two teachers would have had very different ways of explaining their practice, right? So if we had and we did not, the second one, the math teacher was someone we knew and we featured her, right? She wasn't in our study, just to be clear. But I needed somebody really, really great to feature so that you could understand. So that if that teacher and the civics teacher, if you put them in an interview, which we did, and talk to them about, like, well, so here's what we saw in your class, why do you do those things? Like, how do you understand your work as a teacher? How do you think about the purpose of your class for students? What do you want for students in your class? How do you think about things like content and assessment and depth of knowledge, student agency, student voice, right? They would have very different kinds of answers to those questions. And what we're finding is that the ways teachers answer those questions, the depth of developmental knowledge that they bring to their practice, right? The degree to which they're thinking about what kids are learning in their class, not in terms only of learning right here, right now, and for next week, and for the end of the year, and for next year, and next year, and next year, all the way to college, right? But actually they're situating the experience of learning those things into a broader developmental trajectory, where they're thinking it's helping the kids to develop capacities to feel and be in these ways when they're thinking about math. And that is part of mathematical knowledge, because it's what makes the math usable for you, right? You don't learn math just because so you can pass a math test and then you're done. You learn math so that you can think in a particular set of ways, which is useful in certain kinds of situations. And you need to know what those kinds of situations are. And you need to be able to call up the math skills in a sort of productive, purposeful way when you notice you're in those situations. So just think about all the subjective, experiential aspects that are embedded in what I just said. You have to notice. You have to know what they are. You have to notice them. You have to feel yourself in that situation. Then you have to think, oh, and call up math knowledge and be able to do that. And then you have to have the knowledge there to call on, right? And then you have to be able to apply it and use it in a way that actually moves you forward productively. So, all of that has to be situated in the whole of the human, right? In the sort of episodic core of what it means to be me, not just here's my toolkit, right? That I can, that all these little things that I know how to do. And so a teacher like her would have, it doesn't happen by accident what she did, right? She would have a very clear vision for how she wanted kids to engage with that content and what it would mean for them as a person to have engaged in that content in this way, right? And that, that kind of developmental knowledge is what we are trying to move teacher professional development toward. It's what we're trying to support in innovative progressive practices, so-called progressive practices in schools, in order to really shift, not add to what teachers do, but shift what they do so that they situate their work in a different narrative, in a different purpose, in a different trajectory of growth than what we traditionally have expected from them.
And another thing I think we saw in your keynote was just how, like, methodologically different. Your work necessarily has to be than what is traditional, like inputs, outputs. Like I taught A, the test results were this, right? We saw not just like the fMRI brain scans, but then the analysis of the way that the young people talked about their experiences and their life and their reactions to those case studies. And Jane Shore asks in the chat here, like, what can we do to expand how we measure? What do you see in your research that it could apply to measurement? Have you had to just develop your own measures and metrics? Have you been able to pull from different inventories? How have you kind of weighed that, the ability of studying, examining something new, and having the tools and measurements to be able to do that?
So yes, and both, right? I mean, we're inventing things other people have also. There are really great examples of high quality student assessment, throughout the nation and the world, but they're not mainstream for the most part, right? The Performance-Based Assessment Consortium in New York City, for example, has some schools that really have built out extraordinarily rich procedures and skills and capacities for both eliciting developmental thinking on the part of their students and then assessing that and supporting students in their work. I think you saw there was a young man at the end, for a Sudanese immigrant who did his math class, right? So that school is one of those schools, right? If you go watch the full video, which is, there's the link to it is in the bottom of the Building Meaning Builds Teens Brains article, right? If you go watch the 15-minute video, the teachers talk about how they do what they're doing, right? As an example. So there really are fantastic examples, and I'm working with those people to try to understand what they know. But then they're also really interested in working with us to try to understand how is the context for teenager development, for adolescent and youth development changing in the modern world? What do digital spaces do? What does social media do? How do we think about in the current civic space, right? How do we think about mental health? How do we think about the nature of knowledge and the purpose of schools in a modern way that's really responsive to the current world and national situation? So it's a constantly evolving practice. So what I would tell you is start by asking yourself certain key questions that I think start to get you at what you need to know and what you learn. You're developing skills as a teacher. You're developing skills for learning to notice young people's thinking and growth in a different way than you have before, potentially. And so questions like, can't remember if I said in the keynote or not, but what you're having emotion about, right, is what you're thinking about. Emotions are a kind of thinking. So whatever people are having emotion about is what they're thinking about. What they're thinking about, they have a hope of maybe learning about. So ask yourself, what are the emotions about right now in this class, right? And think for different kids and try to be as sort of detached from your own, perspective as possible. Can you appreciate how, this kid and that kid, if I ask them, what are you, right? What are you feeling like and why, right? What are the emotions in that space about? Because if whatever the emotions are about, that's what kids can actually be learning about. So you need to find ways to make the emotions about the ideas. That's a start. And then there are other starts. I mean, mainly, you also just really want to get good at questioning kids. And you can read, about ways to do this, and you can also develop your own. But there's no secret here. You don't have to keep this secret from the kids. You can actually, say, like, I'm trying, share with me how you're thinking about this. I want to understand how you're understanding it. And then get them engaging with each other about how they're understanding it, because you're teaching how to unpack what understanding is, how to challenge assumptions, how to deconstruct things that we assume are true, right? And then engage with those assumptions and then rebuild. And that kind of mental humility and flexibility and willingness to sit with the unknown, to engage with things that are unfamiliar, is a disposition. It's an emotional disposition that teachers need to develop, right? Which also means the teachers need to be safe and supported in their environment. You can't do that as a human being who's a teacher unless you feel safe and not like you're watching your back, right? And not like you don't have enough time and all that kind of stuff. But then also it signals to the kids that that's what I care about. We're here to learn how to think. We're here to engage with and build a community of thinkers who are generating knowledge. I don't have the knowledge. I have the basic input for it. And then we're going to construct the knowledge together in real time. And thinking about the learning process as an inherently what we would call micro developmental development in a short-term scale, right? Is what you're modeling. And that means that you're going to really have to engage deeply with each one of the kids. You need to know what they're thinking about, and you need to design, because we have too many kids in our class to talk with all of them all the time in depth. You have to design the work so that it elicits from kids their dispositions, their ways of thinking, their inventions. Like, let them come up with ideas and show those ideas to each other and to you. Which also means that you can't have a right answer in your head, right? Because if that's what you're aiming for, kids are going to pick up on that right away, and they're going to just try to get the quickest way to that, which isn't necessarily going to develop, right? Because there are no real complete right answers. There might be a right answer to this particular question, but there's many ways to think about it if it's a question worth thinking about. Right.
Brilliant. Josh, I will gladly pass the mic to you, my friend.
Thank you. I'm Josh here in Honolulu, where it's 5:44, and
Good morning, Josh.
my brain is just starting to come up to speed.
Okay.
It's not in the same place that it was when I watched your keynote yesterday. Here's my question. I think perhaps the most powerful part of your keynote that I watched yesterday was at the very end, when there appeared to be a class about financial planning, and the message that was coming through loud and clear is that young person was becoming a financial planner. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about what happens in the brain in the process of becoming. If we have to live for a while, at least, with siloed subjects, chemistry, history, English, whatever, I still think that the primal shift is to flip over from amassing knowledge to becoming something. You become the historian. You become the English teacher, right? I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the emotion that happens when you go through something, when you become something, and how powerful that is. I wonder if you can just share a little bit more.
Yeah, for sure. And I'll also point you to the work of David Perkins, kind of classic work now at Harvard Grad School of Education, who really wrote beautifully about these ideas. The idea of becoming becoming a historian. You're a junior historian, you're a junior scientist, right? You're an apprentice of these things. I think what's so critical that you're kind of intuiting, Josh, is that the process of becoming is not a single linear process that involves, like, the X gyrus of your brain, right? It's like the process of becoming is a process of narratizing. It's a process of constructing subjective experience across time. And the way in which you sort of feel yourself in that space, right? So if you think about that seesaw analogy that I had in there, right? The pivot of the seesaw was regions of the brain and right, that are involved, networks of the brain that are involved in visceral somatosensation, right? The feeling and mapping of your internal guts and visceral body and arousal state and consciousness. And the subjective mapping of those processes subjectively feels like me, right? Neuroscientists have identified, it as a neural correlate of agency, right? So in experiments like where they had people moving a mouse on a screen in the scanner, and then suddenly, the mouse starts to be controlled by them, and the person doesn't know why it's going in weird directions. Like, the same regions go, hey, wait, what? Like, I've lost my control, right? Right. And so what we're saying is those regions are those networks are a pivot for the feeling of me subjectively being called up while I'm thinking about, right, doing my, algebra 2 equations, my exponential, equations, and becoming a bigger story here about helping someone in the world, because these exponential equations are actually useful in becoming a financial planner in this case. So it's in the tipping of all these networks with that's driven by, or sort of balancing on, if you will, the subjective experience of being me, which then becomes reflected upon and constructed into a sort of narrative through time of what it feels like to be powerful based in the ideas I have at my disposal, based in the way I'm using those ideas, not just in what already happened. I got 100% on my quiz, yay, right? But that it's like, I now, when I move through the world, no matter where I go, I have a certain capacity set that comes with me and a disposition to use it. That changes who you are. That's that developmental learning, right? So the big misunderstanding here for so many is that people think that replaces like understanding, quadratic equations, right? No, right? You're embedding the understanding of quadratic equations into something that becomes a narrative about who you are. And that's where the learning really becomes developmental. That's when you take it all the way from learning outcomes, which is really a misnomer. It's learning, mediators, to a developmental outcome that we really care about.
That's awesome. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thanks for the great question. Should I call on people? I'm gonna let you call on people, Nick.
Okay, that sounds good. Yeah, you take a sip, take a breather. Susan, let's get you in here.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Immordino-Yang. I have used your work in my own writing, and I'm so honored that you're here with us today. And your talk that I saw yesterday, obviously you didn't do it yesterday, was wonderful. But I'm an anthropologist, and I have a question about methods and evidence. And I would be persuaded by your work. Sorry, they also want me to confirm Portuguese. Okay. I have a question about the evidence and the methods that you're using, because I would be persuaded by the videos, by the ethnography, by the subjective reports, by the phenomenological account of how the engagement in these authentic experiences has really fostered all of the learning. And the neuroscience part, the fMRI and all of that, the location in the brain seems fascinating, but also perhaps, and I know how hard all of that is, and the equipment is expensive.
You're not gonna hurt my feelings. It's fine. Keep going.
but it almost doesn't seem necessary to persuade me of the benefits of these approaches to learning and becoming. And I wonder, I am also fascinated by neuroscience, but is it partly because that has more rhetorical force and it's more persuasive to the public if it's science and you can show it on brain imaging? I wonder how these two pieces come together, and if we need both.
That's a really great question. So I'll start by saying, when my own daughter was in 10th grade, I sent her to a school in Denmark for 1 year, just a regular public, they call them EFTA schools in Denmark, where it's a 1-year residential program where kids from all over Denmark opt in. Something like 40% of kids opt to do this. It's called an after school. It's like after you finish 9th grade, which is the required school, you're like 15, 16 years old. And then you choose what kind of school you want to do next, or if you want to go to work, or if you want to travel, or what do you want to do, right? And so about 40% of Danish kids opt into these 1-year residential programs that are theme-based. They're interest-based. So you sign up for one of them. You're only allowed to sign up for one, and that's how you get in. But there are schools that are for orchestra music, for kids who are really, really into that, schools for sports and arts and all kinds of different things. My daughter went to one that was for what they called social studies, right? Which is basically, over the doorway on the way into the school in Danish, it said, find yourself. That's what you come to school to do, right? And on the way out in the other direction, it says, you are found. And there's just all dancing people together, right? So it was like a systematic 1-year experience where there were all kinds of academics. This school had a lot of scholarly aspects to it, physics and math classes she could opt into, right? All kinds of biology, all kinds of arts, photography, dance, music, the whole school closes down every fall and puts on an original musical every year that they write, the faculty and the students together, where everybody participates, and it's on some social issue that's, you know, that's pertinent that year, and the kids kind of decide with the adults what the story is going to be, you know, all of that. And, you know, when I dropped her off there, I thought this is this fantastically quote unquote progressive place, although it had been there since 1960, right? And these schools were invented in the when the Danish monarchy was dismantled in the 19th century, right? To try to strategically dismantle the hierarchical nature of Danish society at that time, to try to make it egalitarian. And this was their solution to that. We're going to bring kids who are based around interest, you know, at 16, 17 years old, right? While they're still really idealistic but old enough to have their own minds, right? And not just following their adult, you know, their parents when they're little, or, you know, too set in their ways when they're older, right? So I thought, oh, this is great. My science will be so relevant to these teachers. They'll love it. I'll offer on one of the trips that I, you know, brought my daughter over or whatever, like I'll offer to give a talk for free to the teachers. They weren't interested. They don't need the brain science, right? They already know what they're doing and why they're doing it. You know, so that's the first part of the answer. Like, if you're already doing this in a really deep way, you don't need the science. But that said, there are a lot of very sticky, itchy problems right now that are not solvable without the science. We're getting ourselves new insights into things that I think really matter, like what's the link between learning and mental health, right? What's the link between that sort of feeling of self and brain development that actually supports emotional stability and relational stability and well-being later, right? So those kinds of things have a lot of implications. And then the other thing to understand is that when you're adjudicating between alternatives, right, which we very much are as a mainstream society, we have these progressive approaches, but how do you convince people of them? To bring evidence that they actually have a durable impact on the brain, and that impact in turn predicts well-being in all kinds of metrics that we really care about, is a very powerful statement. It's evidence that you couldn't get any other way. And I think it really helps us to understand in a new way the mechanisms. I mean, it's easy after the fact, once you already know it, to say, well, that makes perfect sense. I knew that already, that, for example, you can't be digging in and moving your pencil on the paper and, you know, responding and listening and assimilating all that you're getting at the same time as you're kind of reflecting and building a narrative and building the meaning and understanding what the big concept is, right? That those two things are trading off with one another. It's obvious once I tell you that, and you're like, oh yeah, I guess I realized that, right? You have to stop and think, you have to, right? And you have to be safe to be able to let go of that outward vigilance in order to be able to construct some kind of bigger understanding, but to see the mechanisms actually play out and understand what else that goes along with, and that's the case and why, actually is a big insight. It's a big insight, and it's a nice one because it does perfectly well accord with what people have been noticing for centuries. We're not saying everything you thought you knew, throw out the window. People are nothing like we always thought they were. What we're saying is, no, right? If you stop and notice, these things are actually very important, and so much so that we can measure how they impact, you know, the physical structure of the brain over time. In that physical structure of the brain, other people are studying how it's related to mental health, for example, and we have a huge crisis in mental health. So to be able to actually show how some kind of normative capacity is building a brain network configuration that we know is associated with mental health by other people's work is also, again, like very powerful. So that's why we need it.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. It's a great question. It's one I wrestle with all the time. I want to change the world for the better for kids and teachers, right? So do I need to be bothering with all this stuff? You know what I mean? And I've come to the conclusion that yes, actually I do. Yeah.
And we're better off for it, so we appreciate it. Trevor,
thanks,
I'll go ahead and go to you.
Yeah. Otherwise, it's my opinion, right? You could just as easily say, no, it's more important that we, you know, pass all these tests and learn all these things. That's how you're right. And then how would you argue back, right? You know. Mhm. You need to understand the mechanism. Also, when things break, when they don't go well, when people aren't motivated, or they have, or they're anxious, or they have other things, we need to understand what is the mechanism undergirding those things, right? And, you can use an analog watch and a digital watch, and it makes no difference. When you can tell time with either one of them, it's fine until it breaks. Then you have to know which one you've got on the inside. Otherwise, you don't know how to fix it. I'm going to let you call on people, Nick, because I don't know who's
Oh, Trevor, you're good. Go ahead.
Cool. Thanks, Dr. Immordino-Yang. I really enjoyed your keynote and all of these answers. And some of the things that you discussed intersect with some research that I do on disciplinary literacy. And one of the key parts of that research, aligning with the ideas that you discussed in your keynote, is this notion of becoming, or of cognitive apprenticeship, or of positioning students to actually engage in authentic disciplinary work and take on the perspective and ways of knowing of those different disciplines. One of the struggles that I've been seeing in some of the research that I've been doing, though, is that oftentimes teachers themselves are separated or alienated from those disciplinary practices. They no longer see themselves as authors or literary scholars or historians or mathematicians, but as teachers. And as we've been discussing, sometimes those teacherly conceptions of identity are really entangled in being not the demonstrator or somebody to show a way of knowing, but a person who knows the facts. And that can kind of get in the way of that apprenticeship model, because it just becomes about transmitting knowledge as opposed to modeling a way of being or doing. So what I'm kind of curious about is there any research base or any ideas or thoughts that you have on creating opportunities for teachers to take on those disciplinary identities and ways of knowing, so they can better foster those environments for their students?
Oh, yeah. That one, I'll just say yes. Yeah, absolutely. I think part of the issue, again, it comes back to who is encouraged to become a teacher, what it means to be a teacher, and the kinds of expectations and work that it involves, and the ways in which we train and prepare our teachers, and then support them in ongoing ways when they're in service, right? We expect certain kinds of outcomes. We don't necessarily expect them to be generative scholars themselves. Many are, but many are not, right? They just see this as kind of a day's work, and my job is to explain Algebra 2 to kids so I can go home and have my regular life. I think that'll get you to C+, right? But that's not going to get you to anywhere really, extraordinary, because it's really about kind of sharing the way of knowing, and so much of, ironically, what is privileged and praised in our teaching profession and in the kids is just being able to critically think about the answer, right? Solving the problem and spitting out the answer quickly, and then moving on to the next thing, and getting your kids to be able to do that. And so long as the incentive structure is geared toward that, and then the ironic other second part is that then people are then reinforced for that behavior, for that way of thinking about it. It kind of builds us into the kind of hole we're in, where we have certain kids who succeed in these high level types of high achieving systems, and teachers who are really, really good at getting students to be able to think in those ways and do those things. But in some ways, it teaches them biology or whatever, but in other ways, it undermines their curiosity to become a scientist. And, so this is something that I think we really have to grapple with in the way that we think about what schooling is and what counts as achievement. So I'll just give you another example from my, I don't know why two of these are coming up today, but so my daughter, when she was in Denmark for her 10th grade year, she decided, being her, the high achieving kid from the high achieving public school district over here, she decided that she was going to take one of the standardized tests that the Danish kids could take, right? It's an option. They're allowed to sign up for these tests if they want to. And, you use them to get yourself into gymnasium and, things if you want to go on a university track. So kids were signing up if they wanted to for different tests, and they could choose the ones they wanted to take. And so Nora decided to just give it a whirl and take the physics test. So because she had never studied physics, she was really scared to do it. She thought, it's so hard and scary, she'd never done it. But she thought, what the heck, I'm in Denver, like nobody's ever gonna need to know about this test if I don't tell them, right? It's fine, right? And I'm taking it in Danish, so heck, let's just get a whirl. But anyway, here's what happens when she signed up to take the Danish standardized physics exam for 10th grade. She had to sign up for whatever she was interested in January. She signed up. The faculty then paired her with another kid from the school who had also signed up to take the physics test. Some random kid who turned out not to be that strong of a student and kind of didn't really know what it meant to understand things deeply and was just out playing soccer when they thought their homework was done. And she's like, no, we don't really understand this yet. The two of them were given a list of all the concepts that could be on the physics exam at the end of the year in May. And there's a whole physics lab, there's a physics teacher, there's everything you need there, and you have to prepare yourself for this test together as a pair. You work together. So they worked together over the couple of months to get ready. And on the day of the exam, here's what the exam looks like, right? A team of 5 physics teachers from their own physics teacher from their own school and 4 others from other schools across the city all come to the school as a panel, and they go in the physics classroom, and then Nora, my daughter, and the other kid, they pick out of a hat one of the topics that was on this list of topics that could be on there. And they pick it out, they look at it, and then in real time, they have 2 hours and a full physics lab to teach their class of physics teachers that idea. And then those teachers are asking them questions. They can help each other. They're like, oh, let's try it like this. Oh, based on her question, what if we explained it with this apparatus? So let's get it out and try it, right? And they're like, okay, let's give us a 5-minute break. We're going to set this up, and then we're going to show you and see if that helps, right? And the 2 of those kids had to figure out in real time how to teach the concept to the class. And of course, the class was asking all kinds of really smart questions, right? And at the end of the 2 hours, the teachers deliberate, and they put together a full narrative report about each kid's capacities and performance on that exam, their knowledge of the physics and how they did. And then both kids and the teachers sit together and they go through those reports. And they said, well, we thought when we asked this question, you really needed her to help you. And you started to explain it wrong, and she had to help you see this. So you didn't really understand that. Is that right? Right. Okay, that's what we thought, blah, blah, blah. And they wrote a whole thing. And at the end, they agree on a score for each kid. That's a different score, right? For each kid, depending on how much they, everybody agreed that they sort of deeply understood the material by the end. And that is your standardized physics exam that gets you into the next level of high school, right? You do it with another kid, you do it in real time, and you teach it to somebody else, and they query you as you go. That's how we judge how much and how well you understand the physics. I mean, that is a hugely different way to think about knowledge than the way that our sort of AP tests or something would do it. I'm not saying AP tests don't test something about physics knowledge. They do, right? But it's just very, very different. What are the affordances of that, right? And what are you learning about, and how are you thinking about becoming a scientist differently, potentially in that context than in our context? So I'm just going to kind of leave you with that open question.
Incredible. Trevor, if you're good, I'll go over here to Pam. Oh, there we go.
Thank you, Nick.
You're good.
Thank you so much for bringing this to us today, Mary Helen. It's really a inspiring message in terms of the work that you're doing. Thanks. I'm thinking about some research that I ran into years ago that was done with students in regards to their perspective on failure. And I'm thinking about right now, one of the themes that I think that we're all engaging in is how does school become more responsive? How does learning become more responsive to kids that are neurodiverse? But in this research, what they found is that they interviewed kids who had failed in school, some of them as young as kindergarten when they were in high school. And there were 2 things that came out of the research: is that kids never perceived themselves as being in the grade level they were in. So if they were a 9th grader and they'd failed 4th grade, they would say, I'm supposed to be in 10th grade, but I'm in 9th grade. The other thing that they found from this research is that students who had failed conceptualized failing a grade level in school or being in a failure mode, a failure cycle, as being worse than losing an arm or a leg. And so we know that emotionally, the concept of failure, whether it's on a test or whether it's a grade level or whether it's just a kid taking on a disposition of failure, is one of the most horrific things that public schools and private schools and learning of any kind that labels kids, that has kids become people who label themselves as failures. And I'm wondering, when you think about assessment, we talk a lot about the experience of learning more through the lens of the kinds of activities that kids do. What you just described is an assessment model. I'm intrigued with the concept of how assessment becomes more caring and more responsive to kids, particularly kids that are going to not see themselves as being good learners unless they get a grade that represents that. And how do we get out of that cycle of, even if we do good work as educators with kids in instruction, we fail them through our assessment models?
Yeah, I totally agree. There's actually a lot that's being written about this right now. There was a Harvard Ed School magazine feature article, of maybe in the spring issue or something, called "The Trouble with Grades" or something along those lines. You could go look at. But I totally agree. I totally agree with you. So I'm just, in answering, I'm going to answer from a human developmental perspective, not from an institutional, like, procedural perspective. Like, how do we make this happen? Okay, that's another conversation. But I think I'll tell you another little story. I give all the stories of my kid when she was in Denmark, right? So this is a kid who you're talking about, Pam. You're talking about the failing kids, right? But I think there's also a real liability to being highly successful in these kinds of systems, right? It reinforces the wrong kind of notion of what success is, and it makes kids afraid to explore. Oftentimes, it makes them afraid, especially in gifted programs. This is actually a documented phenomenon. The kids are told they're super smart and they're right, so don't screw up is the message they get. Just keep doing what you're good at. Don't try things that are new or that are different, or kind of listen to another way to do it, because that's an inefficient way to get to success, right? You want to just keep on the track. So, my kid was doing, super well. She's one of those kids who could do all this stuff. So fine, that's one of the reasons I pulled her out. I'm like, that's not actually deep thinking, right? That's a kind of skill, that's great, but I want to break that up. You go do something that's actually difficult for you, right? What's difficult for you is going to be difficult it's going to be something different for somebody else. But for her, I'm like, heck, go to school in Danish, go learn the language. You don't even know it. Go give it a word, right? Like all that, like, just go do it. Who cares? Like, I want you to break up this, like, I can do what people tell me kind of mindset. So about halfway through the school year, we would talk every night. She'd call me as she was going to bed. And my whole lab knew, like, at 1:30 in the afternoon, I would, like, step outside of the fire escape and, like, talk for half an hour, with my daughter who was going to sleep. And she said to me one night something which I'll never forget. She doesn't remember saying it. To her, it was not, at the time, it was a big deal. And then later she just kind of moved past it. But she said, Mom, I realized something about myself that I'm kind of embarrassed to admit. I said, yeah, because the Danish school this school had no grades. They would ask her, like, are you done yet? Is this project on electromagnetism done? Have you learned what you want to learn? Or do you want to keep working on it? Is there something, right? And the teachers were there to answer questions, to support, to suggest, but, like, there was no accountability in terms of the outcome measure, right? The accountability was, are you working on things? Are you engaged with what you're doing? That's what they really wanted kids to show. And it drove Nora nuts, right? Because she was at some point, she was just like, I wish somebody would just tell me you're doing a really good job. We can see how hard you're working. Like, great job, Nora. Like, you're doing physics in the Danish language when you've only spoke your first word of Danish 2 months ago. Like, that's really difficult. And nobody would say it. They just would not say that. Like, you want to know how to do better? Keep opening your mouth, keep trying to talk. You're getting there. And she's like, do they know how hard this is? And I said, no, they don't know how hard it is. They're not you. And frankly, it doesn't matter. They're telling you how you could do better. And you asked how you could do better. So go try it, right? But wrap around support, right? Like the love in that place is incredible. She's now visiting her old teacher from years ago as she's, traveling through Europe and like staying in his home, right? Like, but what she said to me that night on the phone, I'll never forget. She said, this embarrassing thing I realized. She said, those kids who kind of have a girlfriend or a boyfriend, not, in high school or whatever, not because they really love the person, but because, just because they want somebody to like, sit with at lunch every day and laugh at their jokes and tell them they look nice and go into the party with, so they don't have to be alone and that kind of thing. And I said, yeah. And she said, I realized that's what grades are for me. It's the like, it's not real love. It just is the thing you hang on your arm that reminds you, yeah, I'm smart and funny. Yeah, I'm good looking. Yeah, I'm a cool person, right? You don't actually get any real deep satisfaction out of it. It's just about kind of fulfilling this superficial need for acceptance or for achievement. And it keeps you from looking inward in your own self to decide, how am I doing? How could I be better? What do I want to do next? How am I learning? How am I developing a sense of purpose in this space? Right. So I think what needs to happen in school to handle the problem that you're talking about. And by the way, Pam, we do have some work showing, for example, the difference between Montessori schooled kids and traditionally schooled kids in Geneva, Switzerland, where everybody's doing really well. We have 8 to 12-year-old kids doing math problems in an MRI scanner and showing that the ways they respond to failure neurologically are markedly different depending on whether they learned math in a traditional system where a teacher teaches you the math, you do the problem, you give it in, she or he corrects it, gives it back, right, like that, versus the teacher sets out, the materials you would use to teach yourself math, and then moves about the classroom strategically supporting as kids are grappling with it together and explaining to one another and trying to figure out at their own pace how they would make sense of things. The level of math that the kids from the two groups did was exactly the same, but whereas they got the same number of problems right, the Montessori schooled kids got far more wrong because they didn't skip anything. The traditionally schooled kids skipped things they weren't sure of. And when they did that, they lost a chance to learn, and then they got it wrong the next time and the next time and the next time. Whereas the Montessori school kids took a whirl, learned from it. We could tell that from the way their brain activity was organizing itself when they got it incorrect, to say like, oh, wait, how does that work? And the brain activity suggests they're actually trying to figure out the math. Whereas the brain activity in the traditionally schooled kids suggests that they're trying to remember the right answer, right? So the way in which we set kids up to think about what learning is what's leading to the problem that you're seeing down the line, So what do we really need to do? We need to go to a more narrowized developmental kind of performance-based assessment, which is very difficult because we have such a historical precedent for thinking about right answers as the aim and for thinking about success versus failure. But real mathematicians, for example, don't think of it as failure as, it's disappointing, sure, but it's an extremely important way to understand what's actually going on in the math. And what we saw with the Montessori school kids is they were purposefully screwing it up to make sure they understood it properly. Like, but if you did write this, it would be wrong, right? Right. Okay. Yep. That's what I thought. Okay. Come back. Right. They're playing in the space. And there are standard school systems, mainstream school systems, who teach, for example, math in these ways, like in Japan, right? Where it's much more about featuring the wrong answers prominently and letting kids struggle and the other kids help them. And then they deconstruct the incorrect answers in order to learn how things work. The goal of math class is to learn how things work, not to get to the correct answer. The correct answer isn't a big deal. You get there like, okay, that's, that's not right. Okay. Yeah, that's the end. Okay. Next, right? It's the end. It's not really the right end or the wrong end. It's just the end, right? The process is what matters. So we really need to shift what we're doing toward a process orientation And what I think that really means in the ground is to de-emphasize the outcomes. It's really about emphasizing and looking at the emotion being around the ideas. And when the emotion is around the ideas, kids feel powerful. And the failure narrative gets reframed as a redemption narrative, right? Which was also shown. It's about a struggle that has purpose. And everybody is struggling with purpose because nobody is there is no getting there, right? It's a trajectory we're all on. Different people are at different places on the path and they're engaging in different ways with it, but there's no end. You could go all the way to extremely advanced math, right? Like there is no end point. There is no you're done now, right? It's about being on a path and reflecting actively on where you are in that path. And when we do that, when we dispositionally teach teachers and students to do that, a lot of the problems that you're talking about with these failure narratives become obsolete. They just sort of fall to the wayside. But that said, it's an incredibly difficult problem to solve in the traditional system we have because the narrative is so strong, right? That everybody else gets to go to this grade and you're stuck here, or you are in that grade, but you know you're not supposed to be, right? And it's like, it's all about what level of demonstrated achievement have you done as compared to who are you in this space? How are you engaging with ideas and with skills and capacities? And when we shift the narrative like that, it changes it around. That math class that is featured in the keynote that you can go watch is all about that. Those kids, every single one of them is in that school because they have massively failed out of wherever else they were, right? And the kids explain how the teachers went straight for the big ideas and got them fascinated with those and then backtrack. And the kid says, and I had to learn fractions because I got fascinated by the idea of asymptotes. You're like, really? First math class ever in your life? You're fascinated by asymptotes, right? It becomes part of your reality. It's like it got relevant to my life or whatever the kid says, right? We need to reframe the learning process as a process and focus on the process, which that process is inherently developmental as compared to focusing on the outcome, which is inherently not developmental. It's inherently a static point in time.
Oh my goodness. We probably have time. I'm sorry, Pam. Sarah, if you could go ahead, ask your question. Yeah, this is so awesome. I'm floored right now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Immordino-Yang, for your time. I've been holding this since you published it, your book, and
Nice.
to have the chance to see your keynote and have this opportunity, it's truly a gift. So thank you so much.
Thank you. That's really nice.
So I'm thinking about, I'm really trying to think about how we recognize what it feels like to be me. And I'm thinking about what you talked about in your book around the emotional signals getting in the way of that intuition, which is part of what comes from us versus what's being given to us externally. And so I'm wondering if when I phrase it this way, it's sort of the building the narrative of me that reinforces the strengths I hold and who I hope to show up as in the world, kind of captures that idea correctly or proximally. And then I'm wondering about what your research might help us to do around lifting that somatic awareness. I tend to lean towards the construct of same, different, comparing and contrasting. So I'm thinking about when we lean into place-based or culturally sustaining teaching and then transpose it with something like put it next to something that isn't, and asking students to kind of notice a name, leaning into Peter Johnston's work, right? The feeling of like what resonates, what doesn't, like how can we kind of capture the essence of that and communicate and teach and lean into recognizing what it likes to feel like to be me? Because I think that a lot of us have that dulled for a lot of reasons.
Yeah, me too. I mean, I dropped out of school in 6th grade for some months. Like it just wasn't, same.
7th grade here. So yeah.
That's the age, right? That's the age. Yeah. It's like, I just can't do this. Like, this is just not, yeah, exactly. Yeah. So how do I give a short answer to a long question there? I think in some ways, yes. I think what we need to do is help kids become aware of how fun it is to play with ideas. And you can only get that sense of fun if you understand that it becomes like the effort that goes into it is actually a game. Talk to mathematicians, talk to writers, talk to artists, talk to a theater educator, talk to anybody who is actually a disciplinarian in their field. They do it because they love it, and they're playing with ideas, and they're inventing in real time. And the skills are what you need, right? You got to understand the math in order to invent ideas in math, right? And so then you learning how to feel about the math. That's that learning how to feel idea, or about the theater, or about the notion of what it means to be in a relationship, or whatever it is in Shakespeare, right? All of these things. So what we need to do, I think, is focus not just on the way the kid feels, because they could very well, and probably do, based on the system they've been in so far, feel really feel not great about about things, and they can't trust their intuition about what they know how to do, because we've made it so impossible to learn to have confidence in a genuine sense, right, in this space. In some ways, you just kind of want to get them so involved in a project, in an idea, in a conversation, where, and this is not a euphemism for anything goes. You can have any opinion you want. No, you're going to stop. You can have an opinion, but we're going to push back. We're going to deconstruct it with you. We're going to ask you to reflect on it and maybe change. We're going to ask you to push on other people's and give the counterpoint. And we're going to, right? Those kinds of cultural spaces for having dialogue about the content, right? About the disciplinary ideas, are like a magical experience for human beings, because everyone there, if it's done well, which is a huge lift on the part of the teacher, right? If it's done well, you're facilitating them discovering in themselves, and then the feeling of being engaged with or captivated by a potential, by something that doesn't exist in the here and now, that we're creating together. And it's incredibly motivating to humans to be engaged in that way. And we need to reframe classroom experiences around that notion. And so it's not just about like what resonates with you. That's the start, right? Like, it's a start. But that can also be like, well, I'll tell you what resonates with me. I want to run out that door right now, because every time I've ever tried math before, it's gone really badly. You know what I mean? Like, so like, let's just actually not like go there. Let's just lose ourselves in the mathematical realm itself, in the theater that we're creating, in the picture, the story that we're writing, in the whatever it is, right? Let's lose our own personal self-interest in the service of co-constructing something we can all build together and be part of, that's invented by us. That is inherently powerful, because it actually pulls kids into a space where they experience the power of thinking about ideas that are bigger than just themselves. And that's the key, I think. And really great education systems and teachers do that. Yeah. Yeah, there's another nice example of that. You sort of see it in the math example in the talk that I gave you, right? There's another talk that I think is online that I did for the High Tech High conference a couple of years ago, which has a second, or I gave a master class where there's a second, a third teacher scenario that I think exemplifies this very well, that I couldn't fit in yours, which is a teacher who is teaching about getting a group of kids who are, from very underprivileged backgrounds, right, to write a commentary. They're in an English class, language arts class, and they're writing commentaries, and she's helping them figure out what to write a commentary about, which is, of course, the huge stumbling block. Like, I don't have a story. What am I going to talk about? Nobody wants to, right? And she has this really neat way of having kids put on the board, like she puts these huge sticky notes that says, like, I care about ... right? And some other different things, right? And then the kids just go up with markers and they write what they care about on there. And then she goes through it, and it's like, one kid says, I care about making good art. I care about, and she's just reading through these things. I care about reforming the foster care system, one kid says. And then somebody says, oh, I would like to speak to that one, not the kid who wrote, right? And says, well, I really like that one because I was born and raised in foster care, and that's one thing I'd like to change, and here's what I think, right? And so it's like all of a sudden they start to realize I have a perspective that's valuable. And if I were to understand how to write a 5-paragraph essay, I could get other people to understand my perspective, and that might change the world, right? And all of a sudden you're like, remind me of topic sentences again, right, teacher? Because I really need to make sure people understand what I'm trying to say about the foster care system, because I've lived it and I can tell you there's some things that could be better, right? So like you want to empower the kid in a genuine way, not in a sort of placating way, and not in a way that just ties into their own direct resonance, because that is not necessarily going to be a positive thing or a very deep or rich thing. They don't yet, right? Later it will be, but to start, yeah, great.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, I think we're coming up here on time. I just want to say, Mary Helen, like your energy, enthusiasm, your ability to communicate about these issues in neuroscience that I feel like would be otherwise inaccessible to just like other people in education. I'm so appreciative of that. And I think I represent everyone in the room here in saying thank you for taking the time to spend with us today, to elaborate on your incredible keynote, to address these deep questions on a Monday morning. And a quick shout out too, just for our participants for really blowing up the chat with engagement here, asking incredible questions. How about just one last thank you here, and then I'll just kind of direct people on where to go. But the awesome part about this conference, folks, is that we can continue this conversation on the Discord later on.
Can I just say one last thing?
Of course, you've got the floor.
We just heard 2 days ago that we got a very significant grant from a funder to start to build out these ideas in educational contexts. So if you're interested in becoming potentially, we're calling these things co-labs, part community of practice, part laboratory. We're going to be eventually, in about a year, we're going to be putting out a search for teams of teachers and administrators from across the nation, from very diverse schools, middle and high schools mainly at this point, who are going to work intensively with us and with each other to build new models of schooling that we're going to try to invent and learn from and share with the world. It's really exciting. I don't know if it's going to work, but it's very exciting. And so if you're interested in potentially doing that, follow us on social media is a great way to get our follow candle is a great way to get the announcements, and it's going to come with significant financial resources for the teachers involved, as well as for the schools and districts that they're in. And we're going to try to really invent something new and start a fire, right? So just keep an eye out if you want to keep going with these ideas and you think you could make them happen. Yeah.
Do you have an idea for a timeline for that, when people could maybe?
Yeah, I sure do.
Okay.
All right. So the first group will be next summer. That we're probably going to work with schools we already know, just because we kind of need to try it out first. But then it'll be a year from now, in August or so ish, that the call will come out for people to put together teams to apply to be one of the 7 first collabs that are from a nationally representative sample. So and teachers are going to get a substantial amount of salary. I don't want to say the number because I can't remember exactly how we worked it out on the budget, but they're going to get salary. They're going to spend the summer working together intensively to invent something new and then to try it. And their schools will also get some funds to help support the distribution of what they're doing. And so look for that in a year. And there'll be interim opportunities in the meantime. Yeah.
No, I think just looking at the chat, I think you found your people who would be willing to participate in that.
Yeah, it's gonna be fun. I can tell you that it's gonna be fun.
You can tell, but oh my gosh, one last huge thank you for the keynote, for taking this time. Yes. Thank you so much. I'll just remind participants again, bottle up this energy and this enthusiasm, bring it into the Discord, drop links, drop all that, take a break, grab a lunch, and then you've got the learning journey sessions for whatever track you want to pick. that starts at 1 o'clock Eastern time. So keep an eye on the calendar and everything else for that. And oh my gosh, thank you so much again, Mary Helen, and take care all.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.